So this is a paper that's built after quite a few years of working on making projections of the future costs of dementia, and also thinking about how to finance care, working at an international and quite a global level. So my presentations won't be so much about the US, but will be very much about lots of other parts of the world. And I'm just going to take you through some reflections on the policy responses, particularly to the growing costs of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Next slide, please. So dementia, and I'm using the word dementia, I'm using a very international approach to this. It's basically a syndrome because they're a collection of progressive illnesses that are related to decline of brain function. And the most common form is, of course, Alzheimer's disease, but there are other types, including a very important percentage of dementias are due to vascular dementia that has a very different origin than Alzheimer's disease. And we know that, and we've been already hearing about it today, that in the more severe stages of dementia, people require high levels of care and support, which result in very high costs. Next slide, please. Dementia as a policy issue is very complicated because dementia has multiple impacts. So it affects whether a person can live independently, they can care for themselves, they can stay safe, participate in society, continue in the labor market, or even control their finances. So there are lots of areas in which you could be legislating or developing policy. It also has an impact on family members who quite often will be providing care for very long hours, may have to give up or reduce paid employment, and they may have effects in their own health. Next slide, please. And that means that when policy makers think about dementia, they have lots of different directions in which to go, and very rarely you'll find any country in which they have a dementia plan that is completely balanced across all the different policy areas that they could be tackling. So we may find that some countries have policies that are very focused on the encouragement of search for a disease-modifying treatment. You may find countries that are very focused on risk reduction, on legislation to protect the rights of people with dementia, on mechanisms to reduce the financial risk of high long-term care costs, on preparing and adapting health and long-term care systems to many more people living with dementia. And there is also increasing emphasis on the encouragement of technological solutions. Slide. Next. Thank you. The problem also that policymakers face is that they have to make all these decisions with quite a weak evidence base and a lot of uncertainty. And the uncertainty is due to the nature of the underlying diseases. We still have a limited understanding of how dementia comes about and how, even on Alzheimer's disease, which has been so well researched, we still have a lot of questions about its nature and how and what triggers it and how we can change progression. We have a lot of uncertainty over the return to investment and the search of disease-modifying treatment. I have been working on dementia and long-term care making projections for many years. I have a lot of this time been making projections. In these projections, we sometimes try to take account of the future development of a new drug. And I started about 20 years ago, and the search and the cure was always going to be 10 years ahead. And now that I've been on it for over 20 years, I still think it's going to be at least 10 years ahead. So I do think that we can't really bank on, no matter how much we're spending now, on having in 10 years' time, having these sorted and not having to worry about Alzheimer's or dementia anymore. There's a lot of uncertainty as well about the future costs of care, and from an actuarial perspective, this is very complicated, and it means that it's very hard to calculate the risks and the costs accurately. And we do have a weak evidence base on what works in terms of the care, treatment, and support of people with dementia, as I said, even on the origin of the diseases. Next, please. Now, we know that, and I'm not going to show you figures because these figures have been everywhere already, but we know that we will face very high costs of dementia, and this is often talked about as an economic catastrophe. And this is usually because of the impact that this may have on economic growth, on the impact on government spending and the crowding out of other expenditure, and of course the impact on individual finances. Next, please. But it's also important to think that whenever any projections or any thinking about the future costs of care, that dementia is not happening in an economic vacuum. There are also other factors that matter. There will wider economic trends now. Like now, we suddenly face a completely new unexpected situation that will completely affect how we look at spending on care, on health and care. We will, and again, the current situation, the COVID situation, for example, may also change how we think about the care of older people and how much, are we spending the right amount of money, for example, in keeping people safe who live in care homes. So we may have, there's all sorts of political decisions on what is important and where money should be spent that may affect the acceptability of different levels of spending on health and care. And there are, of course, a lot of labor market changes all over the world, and in Asia in particular, we're seeing a lot of concern about workforce shortages. In other parts of the world, it's the opposite. In Spain, for example, they decided to fund very generously long-term care, but then they had thinking that they would formalize care, but they hadn't really banked on the fact that there was a lot of unemployment and that there wasn't, the whole system they had designed hadn't taken into account that when you have very high unemployment, giving, for example, people pay money to provide care to people who are employed anyway and were not working is not going to really sort out the issues that you were hoping to address initially. And finally, there's of course an issue of automation. And we're seeing all over the world an increase on automation in a lot of industries. We know that although there's some good potential, as has been discussed earlier, for technology to improve care, there's still a lot of care tasks, especially the more personal care tasks like getting somebody dressed, addressing continence, that are not going to be easily automated. So we will still be requiring on a lot of people. And we need to take into account all these factors that are happening in other parts of the economy when we think about how much we're spending and how much dementia is going to affect the economy. Next slide, please. And a question that comes up and that I have been trying to answer is how much will dementia cost? And one thing, there's a lot of people will tell you that there's no methodological agreement. That's why we all come up with different projections. But I have been reflecting on this, and that's where the paper really is focusing on, to the fact that actually when most projection studies are trying to answer slightly different questions, and that is partly why we get very different projections, as well as the methodological complications and limitations and also problems with data that I'm sure all of us can agree on. And one of the questions, for example, that is rarely addressed in projections of the future costs of dementia is what would be the cost of delivering care that matches societal expectations. Most of the models that we do are based on what is the demographic impact on continuing to provide the care that we're providing now, even if we know that the care that we're providing now, as we heard in the previous presentation, may not be what people want. They may be looking for something different, for some new models of care, but when we do the modeling, we always assume we're continuing to doing things as usual and spending the same level with the same levels, for example, of unmet need or the same level of involvement of unpaid carers. Another question we might be asking in our projection models is what will be the impact of new dementia treatments or prevention strategies? And in fact, the bulk of research is on this. And a lot of this is done to show the wonderful things that will happen if we find a hypothetical treatment for dementia, but quite often the hypothetical treatment and the treatment effect, the amount of, for example, the reduction or the delay in people having the disease is completely hypothetical. And that means that we are making projections on the base of something that we're hoping for, but we might be in paper saving lots of money, but we don't actually know that what's the probability that we will really have these treatments. I also would like to emphasize that a lot of the papers on prevention quite often end up finding that a lot of the risk reduction strategies that we know and that we know work in terms of dementia, all they seem to do as well is to also increase life expectancy, which means that people then have the opportunity to live until higher ages when they have an even higher probability of developing dementia again. So it's not clear-cut that through prevention we're going to reduce the cost of dementia, but it is clear-cut that through prevention we can increase longevity further, which we may want anyway, but has other implications that this group is very familiar with. Then another approach is to look at the fiscal implications of dementia. And here you'd be looking at the impact of changes in demography and epidemiology on the public spending on dementia. That requires, for example, that you maintain the same policies and the same eligibility criteria for public funding that you have at the moment. And that helps a lot of countries do this routinely, not just for dementia, but also for old age care, to try to understand what's the impact of aging. And it's very rare to find studies that look at the impact of dementia in the economy. In fact, I found only one or two, and they're quite partial, but there are some studies that are beginning to look at the impact of people exiting the labor market, for example, due to either having dementia and not being able to work longer, or through providing care. And there's increasing evidence, for example, that due to labor market frictions, quite often the models that we have been using traditionally have been underestimating the long-term economic individual impact of stepping out of the labor market to provide care. There's some very good research from the US showing this. And finally, we may be looking as well at what will be the financial of dementia and families, and maybe different care financing regimes may change that, and that's quite an interesting topic, which I think many of you here are interested in, maybe not so much on dementia specifically, but on long-term care more generally. So we need to think whether dementia is sustainable or not. Quite often papers say we will have high cost of dementia, this is unsustainable. In the paper I'm discussing that we need to consider economic, fiscal sustainability, but also political sustainability, and whether governments spend in line with voters' expectations. Next. What we find is that many countries are going for what we call hopeful policies and are not very happy to address the more complicated issues. So they will be focusing on spending a little bit only on trying to invest on treatments, preventions, maybe even technology. Next slide, please. And there'll be much less spending and focus and policy focus on increasing the capacity of healthcare and social protection systems to respond to dementia. And I'm happy to stop here. Thank you very much.